Right, there we are. Yeah, so the WCA was started, I think, about 2019, 2020, and it really brings together about 30 different individual groups from across the county, organisations like Sustainable Shurston and Lower Carbon Bradford-on-Avon, and Improved Cycling and Transport in Chippenham. And it really has a pretty broad coverage. And if you try and then use that to work out the membership, we think it's probably over 600, although some of our groups aren't that accurate on keeping the numbers of people they have working for them. If you want to find out more about the groups and one that might be in your area, the link's here on the page. And clearly you can go to the Wiltshire Climate Alliance website to learn more. Within the Wiltshire Climate Alliance, my role is I'm the steering group member who's responsible for the business engagement work group. And when I started this role about February 2022, I thought I'd just say what it is we're trying to do. And our main role is to try and engage positively with businesses in the county to see if we can increase best practice sustainability across all different business sectors, organisations and companies across the very wide range of areas that covers. Try and reduce damaging climate and environmental impacts from conducted business activities, and report and highlight on good and bad business practice within businesses. So when I sat down and looked at trying to tackle this set of targets, it seemed to me it'd be pretty unreasonable to just go along and knock on the doors of companies and say, hello, I'm Keith from the Wiltshire Climate Alliance. Would you like to talk to me about your business policy? So I thought the best thing to do was to do some research and try and work out what's the status, what's the sort of snapshot picture of how businesses in general across the county are managing and recording on their climate impacts. And that really kicked off this business research project, which we started about March last year. And this is what we did. First of all, I thought, well, why don't we actually ask our existing network of members if they know of or are aware of businesses in their locality whom they think might be particularly high impact businesses, and to put those names forward. So that was coming in early last year. And then when I looked at the sort of 54 businesses we amassed, I thought this is an awful lot of work to do to try and evaluate and assess what their policy and climate actions have been. So then I recruited a team of volunteer business researchers, which boiled down to, when we got into it, about 4 or 5 people who were keen and committed and prepared to put in the long hours. In order to come up with a slightly scientific approach, we prepared an assessment methodology and a scoring system so that each of the researchers could assess a company in a standardized and methodical manner. And we trained people on how to do that. And then we cracked on with the work, really, and tried to look at business policy targets, what they were reporting and actions that had been taken. And in the end, there were 49 companies that kind of were valid businesses to look at. We lost a few because we simply couldn't find much about them, or a business that was suggested like a cooperative of small farms. Well, there simply isn't any data on a cooperative of small farms. Then around about last November, December, we started analysing all the work that we'd amassed. And then we wrote a report and published that in the start of April this year. And now in 2023, our aim is to use the findings from this work to try and influence key stakeholders and promote more change for the better. Before we get into the details, I thought it's worth just sort of taking a bit of time to look at this question, just how big is business impact? I think most individual citizens of Wiltshire are aware that what they do themselves has impact, but I'm not sure that people think so much about what impact businesses have on the environment. So to get some sort of data, there's about 5.5 million limited companies registered with Companies House in the UK. 4 and a bit of those are just one-man bands working at home who want to have limited company status. So kind of businesses that create employment there's about 1.4 million registered companies who employ more than one person. But of those, under current UK regulations, it's a really small number. It's estimated about 12,000 businesses are large enough to fall under the thresholds of turnover employment, which I think is 250 people. Turnover, I think, is 36 million. And there's also a capital value that makes them fall under the current UK government regulations, streamlined energy and carbon reporting rules that were brought in 2019 by a man called Rishi Sunak when he was responsible for that part of government. So actually, at the moment, only the big firms that fall within that group are only about 0.8% of all businesses who are actually regulated and must by law make a report on their carbon impact. However, it is worth saying that the skew here is all towards the mega big companies. So that small number, that 12,000, actually are estimated to represent about 40% of UK sales turnover. So it's quite a big coverage of the consumption from business. Down at the local level, there's kind of, I haven't yet got a hard number on how many active businesses are there in Wiltshire. I did look up the list of all the premises that are listed as business premises in the county. There's 13,000 of those. Now, quite a lot of those might be inactive, but there must be several thousand businesses in Wiltshire who are having an impact. One piece of data I did find about, to answer the question of, what's business impact in the total of Wiltshire, is there's a 15 or 16-year-old piece of ongoing annual research, which is carried out for the government by BIS department, which I think has now got another mnemonic in the last couple of years. And I spoke with the man who runs this huge model that looks at the whole of the UK as a map and maps out all the direct carbon emission points and looks at the mix of companies and the roads and the transport. And then every individual council in the county gets sent every year a summary of what their direct emissions are. And this pie chart is from the Wiltshire Council's climate strategy documents that came out a couple of years ago. And you can see that it shows, industry and commerce as 29%, homes and private dwellings 26%, and then this huge slice, which is just put down to transport. And I thought, well, hang on, you could allocate transport if you knew what the vehicles were to either industrial, commercial, or private. And when you do that, which I did by getting some data from the originator of the model, you find out that actually an awful large amount of transport is the act of receiving goods and delivering goods and moving things around for business. So I think that about 54% of direct carbon impacts in Wiltshire using this model are allocated to business. But of course, this is only direct emissions, not scope 3, which is to do with the supply chain. For those people on the talk who aren't familiar with scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, this is how it looks for a business. The direct stuff is if you have a stack, if you're an incinerator or you're making cement, you'll have a big chimney on site emitting CO2 and other gases. Your own vehicles are responsible for exhaust fumes into the atmosphere. Your scope 2, which is included in the reporting, is primarily the electricity that you use in your factory, but it could be piped in steam from another business nearby. There's only scope 1 and scope 2 that get reported under the government guidelines. Scope 3 is everything to do with your inward supply chain, this curve here, and your downstream usage and supply of your products. The purchase raw materials, capital goods, transport and distribution that you pay for, waste that you generate, employee travel, business travel. Quite a lot of the inward side are measurable. And downstream, you've got things like onward processing of your products. If you sold plastic pellets and they were sold to a molder, they molded components, that would create a lot of extra emissions from using the product. And then the use phase could be absolutely huge. Imagine if the motor industry had to report the use phase for all the cars sold. End of life treatment could be 10, 15, 20 years down the line when the product reaches end of life and gets disposed of. So the conclusion from this is that as I've done the research, there's various numbers about how much of big businesses' emissions are Scope 3, and it's estimated that 70 to 90% of total business carbon impact is from this Scope 3, and it's not currently reported. So now let's dive into the actual project work we did. And all I can give in the time we've got is a bit of a brief overview. First of all, the assessment methodology was put together by looking at all the well-known certification and assessment schemes out there, SBTi, Global Carbon Reporting, B Corp, there's lots of them. And generally they look at whether the business has a clear policy, are there good targets and goals, what's the quality of the reporting that they generate, is it detailed, clear, easy to follow, is there clarity about who's in charge of running this function within the business, and are all the stakeholders engaged, suppliers, investors, employees. Then we were looking for good evidence when we looked at firms of what they've actually achieved and what quantified performance they've got to date. And when our assessors had done that, they had a 45 question form to work through, they were then able to come up with an overall score. There's a lot of data for each business. And when we did a review, we made sure that another one of the researchers looked at the results to apply a consistent methodology for scoring. And our score system was a 0 to 10 score for all those questions, and then a final overall number. And we scored that with red, amber, green. Typically within each section, so environmental policy, we had a headline number. Does the company have a clearly stated policy? And then we drilled down into, does it include carbon, energy use, transport? What metrics are there about Scope 3? How long is it in operation? Is there clarity about the impact of different parts of the business, et cetera, et cetera? So there's quite a lot of work. For some of the big companies, it would take a couple of days to go through all their data. Smaller businesses, you could perhaps do in 2 or 4 hours. And micro businesses, very often, there was just nothing. The firms we looked at, we ended up with that methodology where we asked the Wiltshire Climate Alliance members to put forward businesses. So that isn't a random sample of businesses in Wiltshire. It's the ones that our members put forward, which they felt were likely to be quite big impact. So businesses with big factory sites, lots of transport, visible large infrastructure tend to be the ones that get put forward. And you can see that that's primarily manufacturing and logistics companies down here. And we were skewed towards large businesses, which is what you might expect. I'll go straight into the headline results, having briefly explained what we did. And for those who've not yet had a chance to see it, there's a link here and available at the end that lets you download a full copy of the report. This graph is probably the one that summarizes things on one page of the overall high-level results. What this shows for all the 49 companies we looked at, the frequency, the number of companies that scored each score, and along the bottom, the range of scores from 0 to 10. So 9 businesses were scored 0. 0 businesses scored 10. In our sort of green band, we got 9 companies who were doing pretty good. But unfortunately, as you can see, the skew is towards the more red than amber, and then amber, then green. So maybe this is what you might expect from things that are fairly early on in the sort of journey for businesses. Looking at our overall sort of league table, so we put this in order of score for all the 49 companies we looked at to try and pull out some patterns and useful things that we could see. Now, clearly in the ones that were in the 7 and 8 score range, which is our green area, mostly it's the large companies, which you might expect because they have to do reporting. They're big enough to have significant resources that they can put people on the job and deliver a thorough and detailed carbon report. But also I thought it was notable that these in the red box here, Two of our medium-sized businesses in the area also scored quite highly. Good Energy, because what they do is deliver environmental and sustainable energy supply to organisations and individuals. And then a bakery whose part of their marketing ethos is to be natural and friendly and environmentally conscious in what they do. So I thought that was good. One thing that did surprise me is a couple of the really big names you might not naturally associate with being amazingly environmental businesses. Wincanton, a transport and distribution business. Tarmac, bitumen from oil with aggregates, and cement, big construction, aggregates and materials. But I suppose what you can argue is if they're starting as a very high impact business, maybe that means there's a lot they can do to make big changes. And when you look at their reports and the policy and what they've got on with, they did score very well. Just quickly, I won't spend ages on this. It's available in the report. Then going down through the sort of league table in slices, these are the firms in the sort of 4, 5 and 6 score range. Again, mostly the large companies coming out and being distilled out to the top end, which you might think, and 1 or 2 small and medium-sized businesses in there. Lower range scores, you know, some companies there, you look at their names and you think, well, you'd think they'd be able to do a really good job, but in our assessment of what we found, they didn't get a good score. It's fair to say, I think, that we could only score on what we could see as looking into the business from the outside. So that's the publicly available information, the published accounts and reports, and any other data we could find. And then what I've called my relegation zone, scoring 0 or 1, dominated by micro and small businesses, where largely speaking, if you visit the website of some of these small companies and you look for a word like environment, sustainable, carbon, and you find nothing at all, and there's no policy, you have no choice but to say they seem to be doing not a lot. That was a really quick whiz through the data. These are the main findings and learning points we can draw out. Larger firms are doing the most, as you might expect, because they're the ones who have to. If you can find evidence of strong governance, a good, well-written policy and clearly defined targets, then that tends to be the firms that are delivering some good results already. Generally, small and micro-sized firms below about 50 staff nearly all have nil policy and no reportable evidence that they're doing a great deal, even though they might be, they're just not talking about it. Scope 3 emissions, we drilled into that in some detail. There's more in the report about the work we did there. Mostly being ignored because it actually isn't part of the regulated requirement, or only reported on the easy bits like our business travel, or our suppliers tell us that their carbon impacts are thus. Very little being done on the downstream impact of products sold or what happens to products and services at the end of life. We did a lot of effort to find out if companies appear to be on track to get to their stated targets. And when we did that, it's difficult to do. We found that only about 4 firms appear to be what I would call on track. One thing that is notable is that it's still relatively early in the journey for many businesses. So as they got started, their baseline reporting years tend to be 2018, 2019, and 2020. So trying to pull out trend lines from a 3-point graph is very difficult. And for nearly all firms we looked at, that starting period bridged the whole of the lockdown and COVID crisis time. So they're not really typical years. One thing that we did pull out is the changes and achievements which are being reported already, as you might expect, are the kind of easy wins. So things like, let's switch our electrical supply to a company that can tell us they're supplying us green power. Let's put solar panels on the roof of the factory. Let's turn all the lighting from incandescent light bulbs to LED. Let's make the fleet, car, pool electrical. Those are good things to do because they get you easy wins early on. But I don't think we found any organisations who were fundamentally changing the core part of their business. If your business is buying oil-based polymers, using energy to make them into components and distributing those out across the country, that's what you do. And unless there's a different type of polymer that's not oil-based, a different way of molding polymer that doesn't use energy, and a way of transporting things much lower, it's really difficult for you to cut into your fundamental core. My worry is that once the easy wins are delivered, will businesses be able to tackle their fundamental core? Will Tarmac be able to replace bitumen and cement? Will Wincanton be able to replace all their lorries with some technology which is not so impactful on the environment? We did find some evidence of what we called green hushing. You look at a firm, you think, hang on, they're really technical, they're engineers, they're scientists, they know how to measure and monitor and record things, and yet their reporting was minimal. And it does seem to be a thing that's happening. I suspect that some organisations simply don't want to set down a clear target for where they're going to get to and then be seen to fail. Consumer-facing brands are definitely the ones that are likely to be doing more. They've realised that their consumers want to buy products and services which they can trust are greener and more sustainable. But there's a massive action gap with the SMEs. That's where there's a load of work to be done, and many don't seem to have started. Just a quick example of what good policy looks like to sort of give you a feel. I quite like this really simple table. Clarity about the scope 1 and 2 and scope 3. Clarity about when they're going to get there, how much they're going to reduce each thing, and where they want to get at the end. If everybody did that, life would be a load more simple, but these weren't that frequent. A bit I mentioned earlier about performance and whether businesses are going to get to their end point. This is an example for Wincanton Logistics, and they show their 3 years, which were the 2 years during sort of lockdown, and then boosting out of lockdown with a big increase in revenue and an increase in their total CO2. However, when they do what they have to do, which is present an intensity ratio, which in this case is tons of CO2 per million of revenue, then the graph above does actually start to follow their orange line. I'll leave you to decide if there's going to be a nice blue graph that goes all the way down. Right, main recommendations. At the government level, I clearly think that the UK government needs to extend regulated reporting to at least 50% of firms and maybe 75% of all sales. You may have picked up that I think unless we start measuring and recording scope 3, we're missing some of the biggest impacts of large businesses. So that needs to be included, definitely for large companies. And I think that it's no good just reporting what you've done. Firms need to be publishing a plan about where they're going to go. What's their plan to get there? At the local council level, there were a few other recommendations. It seems to me the council is an organisation which receives public money, spends it on goods and services, and it's that spending thing where they could probably be much more proactive in tightening procurement rules to be sustainability led. And I also wonder if when we're building new infrastructure for business, like big distribution centres next to the M4, those buildings and infrastructure installations should be much greener. In terms of what local businesses can do, I would like to say, take a look at this report and look at some of the examples of the top 5 firms who are doing good stuff and model your carbon reporting and management of emissions around those good examples, because it's there available to be seen. If you haven't even started yet, which is the micro small businesses, in all the research we did, this website, Zero Carbon Business, was the absolute best one in terms of clarity and a great place to start. So, quick whiz through the report, quick headline findings. Right now, we're doing this communicate and report findings. So you've got here, have a webinar event to invite stakeholders. Thank you. I hope to get out and talk to a lot more people who are in the area who might be interested, like maybe Business West and area boards of the council, local groups who want to start influencing business. And then as we move on, what we're going to do is start engaging more closely with companies and try and work out where we can have the most bang for our buck in terms of focusing effort. That may be helping town councils to support their local small firms, because that's where the big gap is. Right, I'll stop now, and the report download link is here. I'll send the slides out to you all afterwards. There's also a list of useful resources as well. Right. Maybe I should pick up a few key questions if there are any. And if anybody has got a question they'd like to put verbally, then please just let me know. Put your hand up. Full reports there. I can't see, if there's no questions, we will move straight on to the next speaker. Hello there. Can you unmute yourself?
Yep. Do you want me to share my screen, Keith?
Yes, please share your screen in the way that I did. I think I introduced you at the start, Cherry. So,
Keith, there is a quick question, I think, from Andrew. Andrew's got his hand up.
Sorry. Okay. Yes. If you could unmute Andrew, then please put your question. Sorry, Andrew, can't hear you at the moment. Can you unmute yourself?
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now, Andrew.
3 questions or points. You didn't mention organisations like the FSB and perhaps appropriately now not the CBI. Are they both in terms of FSB giving you access to local businesses, and whether they are themselves encouraging the setting of standards?
That's very, sorry, do you want me to take that one now?
I'll give you the 3.
Yeah.
ISO 14001, I thought, which is the environmental standards, I thought was a requirement for contracts with local councils. And if it is, I'm, again, and that gives you a complete framework for judging the performance of the company. So that must be another useful source. And my third point was that the scope 3, I think, can only be measured, if at all, in one direction. You talked about upwards and downwards, or backwards and forwards, I can't remember. But of course, the scope 3 of somebody's input is the scope 3 of somebody else's output. So you need to be very clear that you're only measuring in one direction.
Okay. Right, number 1 is pretty timely. I've been communicating with the Federation of Small Business locally in the area, and they are trying to deal with the issue of how do they encourage particularly SMEs to become better at managing their climate impacts and reporting what they do. And tomorrow I was due to go to an event which was a climate summit for small businesses, which they were running free of charge, I think, of about £5. I was going to go and set up my little stall and talk about what we've done. Excellent. They had to cancel that because they couldn't get enough attendees. So I see work being done by the local enterprise partnership. Southwest Local Enterprise Partnership. I see work being done by Business West, and they, they do typical things like have a webinar how to start measuring your climate impact, and try and have meetings where they get together people from within the small business community to learn, and then they have very useful guides on the thing. So I think there's some effort there, and there's usually a person who's nominated as the sort of one who's trying to drive forward climate change and environmental practice. But when I talk to people, I think unfortunately they all suffer from the same thing in the small business area, which is a degree of apathy, focused on just daily delivering your goods, getting your cash in and employing your staff and paying your wages, and not the resources or time to do that job itself. So I think there's things happening, but not enough. ISO 14001, yes, I was in a company that had that myself a few years ago. Very thorough, very detailed. Really probably only applicable to larger organizations who've got the resources and skills to do it. Probably businesses over 50, I would guess.
Yeah.
I don't know for a fact whether that's a part of the council's procurement requirement. I suspect not, but I don't know as a fact. Scope 3, I agree, much more difficult to measure downstream. But I think there could be some effort made. I don't think in this whole world of climate reduction, accuracy is actually 100% important. Broad brush is good. So if, say, the BMW car plant knows how many mini cars it's put onto the UK market, it wouldn't be very difficult to get an average number of miles travelled and an idea of how many of the end-of-life minis then arrive, say, at a plant where we've covered the metal and the steel. So I think we could make broad brush estimates for people.
I absolutely agree. My point was a slightly pedantic one, that it's double counting if you count upward, inwards and outwards.
Yes, on B2B supply, I agree. Yeah. So if you supplied, like I gave in my example, plastic pellets to somebody, and then that company melts them and uses energy to make a thing and eventually supplies a vacuum cleaner, perhaps it's only the end user who then is the final consumer and user of the product who's the one who's sick. I hope that's a brief enough answer, because I do need to crack on now, because Cheris has to crack on with it. Thanks very much for your question.
Okay.
Sorry, Cheris, on you go.
All right, no problem. Can you see my screen? Okay,
yes,
good.
That's excellent.
All right, so Keith's invited me to speak at this presentation today to go through the challenges and opportunities that we have as an organisation as Good Energy in calculating our own emissions. So wanted to give you some introduction into what we do report on, the difficulties that we've faced, the initiatives that have opened up for us, and where we are now, really. So when I say Good Energy's carbon emissions, this was our scope for 2022, and a lot of, as you can see from the pie chart, a lot of the emissions that we have come from commuting, people visiting and travelling to our offices, and that's scope 3. Scope 1 and 2, we are in a leased office. We're actually in the Wiltshire Council building, but nonetheless, we still have quite accurate information on our energy consumption rather. And we, due to renewable tariffs, we can report them as fairly low, but nonetheless are still monitored and tracked, the consumption is, so that we can still implement energy saving initiatives, because the best energy is the energy not used, in my opinion. Then on the right, we've got a breakdown of what all of the different colours are. I would say as well that this isn't extensive, it's what we can gather at the moment, and I'll go into challenges on that and data availability in a moment. But it's what we can reliably say from our data collection and feel comfortable in publishing. What was interesting in the last 2 years, 2021 reporting and 2022, was that we just started calculating emissions from people working at home. considering the aftermath of the pandemic and people not coming to the office as much, or some people not coming to the office as much. And that's a methodology that's still fairly crude, in my opinion, as well. But as Keith said, it's a bit of a broad brush, reasonable estimate, and is something that we can at least start monitoring and aim to improve over the next year or two as methodologies improve and data improves as well. Each of the items that are included within the scope have various methods of data collection. Commuting and home working is, there's a couple of ways we calculate commuting. We have a system that books desks for us in the office, but it also calculates each individual's commuter profile. So for everyone that has booked a desk, they have a commuter profile and it attributes how they've come to the office. So we can download that data, but we also do back up that data with a travel survey that goes out each year. And within that travel survey asks questions on individuals' heating consumption in their own homes, their tariffs, the type of electricity, how often they use it, what during which months do they use it, that kind of thing. Which is why I say it's fairly crude and perhaps not as accurate as having energy consumption and meter readings without being so intrusive and asking questions such as which of the lights in your house are on at what times of day, and without getting into too much detail. And then we've got other items on this list, equipment from home working, so that is calculating electricity usage using the wattages of our laptops, and any other equipment issued to our individuals by Good Energy. And then we've got waste consumption, which if you have an environmental management system, ISO 14001 is one of our bigger environmental aspects. So we need to have that information readily available anyway. So it serves us quite well in reporting on our carbon emissions too. And we even try to, as much as possible, try to report on how much fruit and milk we use in our offices. Fruit, not so much, is fairly low. It's not eaten as much as milk is consumed, and milk has a high emissions factor. So it's something that we've been monitoring and has actually increased in the last year. So that's something that this whole scope is something that continuously evolves. Our next step with evolving this scope is to start looking at ways we can use we can calculate the energy consumption from the server rooms, the cloud-based server rooms that we use. So we have an on-prem server room here, which is reported within our energy consumption and meter readings. But we do have a lot of software that our IT developers use that is all cloud-based and based on computation. So we're looking at ways in how we can start calculating that information as well. So what I'm trying to say really is that my opinion would be to allow for your scope to evolve, for your scope and methodology to mature, because as data becomes more readily available, your processes in collecting that data becomes easier. If you put the effort into making it easier and more streamlined, then of course the output of your calculation will change as well. That's my next slide. If I move this strange menu that keeps popping up. Okay, so challenges, and I've put them into 3 different categories: methodology and scope. I've touched on this a little bit, and Keith has as well. But setting, if you're not familiar with calculating emissions to begin with, then setting the scope of your emissions is quite daunting. When you sit back and look at all of your environmental aspects from your operations and where you're emitting carbon, could feel quite overwhelming, and especially if you don't have already data collection processes in place. So implementing a methodology is challenging. There is a standard, another ISO standard that helps you with that and provides a framework, which is 14,064. It's not a mandatory, again, depends on the size of your business, but it's not mandatory to use that methodology. But for the SECR requirements, it stands you in good stead to comply with that legislation. And I found it particularly helpful myself. And also setting a baseline and knowing when to recalculate that baseline, because we have, Good Energy have started calculating their emissions in 2015. The methodology back then was quite minimal, and I'll show you, I've got one slide that shows you our emissions over the years, and we had an increase because our methodology improved. But it's knowing when to set a baseline year that you can start to make initiatives reductions from as a comparable year. And 2020 was a complete anomaly for many reasons, but the obvious one as well. So having a baseline recalculation policy helps an organization then understand or revisit that policy and ask, well, when do I have to recalculate this baseline? Is it when my business operations change quite dramatically? Is it when we acquire a new business maybe? Is it because the last couple of years have been not comparable, and that could be because of data collection processes have improved? And just setting out some guidelines for yourself that helps you keep some sort of consistency and standardization. The next challenge is data availability, collection, reliable record keeping, and that really comes from someone who is good at administration, to be honest, and keeping good documents in place. That also allows you to improve your data collection processes over time, implementing better data collection processes, although, as I said, be prepared for this to improve your methodology and could change the output of your calculation, and your emissions could increase. But making it easier for you in the long run. So an example of that would be back in 2016, our expense process was quite convoluted. The data that we had from our expense forms was hard to capture, hard to download, hard to analyze and summarize. But simply by updating the expense form, making some fields mandatory, then communicating why it's changed to internal stakeholders, and asking people to keep on top of it, drastically improved the data that we then received, and people understood why we're asking for the miles that the train journey used, or the miles that they used to travel to a certain meeting. And as I said, yeah, really improved our data collection processes. Using averages to predict, help you predict even when data is lacking. That's been really helpful, especially around 2020. We used, instead of comparing 2019 to 2020, we used 2021's information to compare with 2019. Slightly different activities taking place, but much more comparable than 2020 was. And I also find the emissions factors that are published by the government each year by DEFRA are sometimes quite hard to interpret. There's a lot of information in one document, and without reading through most of it in quite a lot of detail, it's hard to know which emissions factor you should be using for your emissions source. So that's been a challenge as well. And then lastly is stakeholder engagement. So keeping good working relations with the people that send you the data that you need, and whether that's internal or external, doesn't really matter. But there isn't, unless you really explain the reason why you're asking for this data and why you're asking for it maybe on a monthly basis or however your reporting frequency is, there's not much in it for them to give it to you. So you really need to work with them and get them to understand why you're asking for it, and really get your point across. And then managing the expectations of auditors and clearly showing your working. So We have our carbon accounts audited because we publish it publicly in our annual reports, and it's on our website as well. But we also, because we have ISO 14001, that's a requirement of that standard too. So when you have an auditor, particularly looking through your calculations with a fine-tooth comb, you really need to be able to explain the reasons why you've come to that reasonable assumption, or why you've used this average, or why you've used this moving average and because of this one, so that you've got some information and credible sources to back your calculations up. And all of those three categories, for me particularly, were, and perhaps still are, pretty daunting. So I'll move on to what the challenges are. What has helped with these challenges, though, as I said, I've given a few examples, but improved data collection has helped massively. And even asking for internal training or having the time to understand what you're reading rather than whizzing through it and trying to spend 10 minutes to try and pick it all up. There's some good environmental consultants out there that would help as well. And just being prepared to learn if you're not already in the know, because back in 2016, I wasn't myself, and it's taken a long time for me to understand it too. But the opportunities that come out of carbon reporting, again, I've split it into three buckets, but you get really good overview of the operation of your business. So you get good insight into business operations, helping to implement both carbon reduction and cost saving initiatives. So one of the examples for Good Energy is a consistent or an annual review of our office space compared to our headcount, and making sure that the office space that we have is not in excess, obviously not too little, but in excess of what we need. Having shorter lease negotiations in place so that we can move our offices around when we feel we need to, and we're not stuck in a long-term lease with a giant office with a few people in. That's actually served us well over COVID as well. And there's been both a cost reduction saving and carbon because of energy consumption. So that's been particularly useful. The second category is transparency and commitment. And really what I'm saying here is that having the ability to be transparent and commit to both mandatory and voluntary carbon reduction programs gives your audiences, your customers, the public, the commitment that you're trying to send out. It reinforces people in your purpose and your ethos, and making that public commitment by publishing these carbon reports certainly helps with that. Good Energy itself, we've committed to making a difference to people and planet, and having these statistics in place just reinforce that we mean what we say we mean. And then again, stakeholder engagement is both a challenge and an opportunity, in my opinion, because although you have a few people to work with and rely on for data collection and for record keeping, those same people you can use to help reinforce or help support them set their own carbon reduction targets, or even start their own carbon reduction journey. This is actually one of the requirements of having a science-based target, is encouraging your partners or stakeholders in your supply chain as much as possible to set their own science-based targets if they can, or even start their own journeys. I'll mention science-based targets on my last slide. And then lastly, one of the opportunities I've also identified here is increasing employee engagement. We've found, certainly at Good Energy, that publicly communicating this information, not just in our annual reports and externally, but internally. We have monthly meetings where we share good practice around the business, and carbon reporting often comes up, as does other sustainable certifications. But it gives your employees the purpose for and the desire to want to work for a meaningful employer and work for an employer that they are proud of. And that's an opportunity in itself. So this slide goes, as I said, is a journey of our emissions since 2016, which was really when, although we started calculating in 2015, it's kind of when the methodology really established itself, and goes up until 2022. So what this graph shows is between the years of 2016 to 2019, our data collection methods improved, which is the reason for the spike in 2017, or one of the reasons. And we also then, after 2017 and up to 2019, reduced our office space by almost 30%, which then had a reduction in our energy consumption. We've got a big dip in 2020 because it was a COVID year, and our methodology simply didn't reflect our working practice. We hadn't included or accounted for any home working emissions within that methodology, and in my opinion is an anomaly. 2021 and 2022 is when we started implementing what we call hybrid working, which is where employees come to the office once or twice a week. So our commuting started to increase again, and as people started to get more out into the world again, business travel also increased. But we were still able to keep the emissions trend line fairly low since setting our science-based target in 2022. So the trend line runs through most of the error bars, which hopefully helps reinforce the accuracy of some of our calculations. But what I would recommend, and just to have another opinion on your calculations really, is having someone else verify it, whether that's someone internally, a couple of people internally, or employing or appointing an external verifier to look through your calculations. You could be making a really minor mistake. It could be a typo even, but has quite a dramatic effect on your output calculation. It could be a typo in the emissions factor because they are hard to interpret, which then could have quite an effect on your output calculation. So a definite recommendation for me is to have someone verify it, whether that's internal or external. And then just lastly, to talking about voluntary carbon reduction schemes, one of them is the Science Based Targets Initiative. Keith already mentioned it briefly, but it's a program that allows businesses to set a carbon reduction target that's in line with the latest climate science. And those targets are supporting the limiting of global temperature increase to 1.5 degree or well below 2 degrees. So we've set a 1.5 degree aligned target, which is a 50% reduction. And this is across all scopes, scope 1, 2, and 3, from our baseline year of 2018. And that's it from me.
Thank you very much. That was great to see. And that's what the sort of quality of information you get when one of our companies is scored quite highly. So, and there I was really like a graph with error points on it. Makes me feel warm inside as an engineer to see that someone understands that every bit of data has a plus or minus error band, and that you shouldn't get too upset if your line isn't exactly down the middle if it follows the error band. So that was good. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Picking up on a few more questions in the last few minutes we've got, I've had a little bit of time to go back through some of the chat, and there were a couple of questions posed earlier on. One of those I've got noted here was someone called Kim. Sorry, I haven't noted your surname. What was the date that we completed the assessments? We finished doing our assessments of the 50 firms during November last year, 2022, and then December we completed the peer reviews where other researchers then studied the individual score sheets to see if they would have given a broadly the same score. And we contacted all the companies at that period as well, which leads us into our next question from Ariane Crampton from Wiltshire Council. I think we made a point when we finished every assessment on our initial assessment thing of writing to the company involved saying, look, we're a team of volunteer citizens, we've got to look at your business. would you be interested in seeing your full assessment? Because, you know, it might be quite useful to get someone to assess externally what your reporting quality looks like. And would you like to engage with us, see if we can talk about, you know, is there more data that you've got that's not published that you could use, and can we help you to move forward? A bit of engagement. Unfortunately, out of the 50 firms, only 5 responded. One of them notably just come from somebody called Press Office Act, and the name of the firm, decided me right into their environmental director and their health and safety and sustainability manager by name. I kept getting emails back from Press Office Act, and they never ever gave me a name. So it was weird. It was a little bit threatening, like, don't publish anything about us that we might not want you to publish. So anyway, that was one. But others were really positive. Of the 5 that did actually get back, even though only 5 out of the 50 got back, I had detailed discussions with a technical director at a plastic pipe making company, a business that made molded protective parts of the military, engaged. One man, the director of a company making mattresses for beds, spent 2 hours on the phone with him. He's talking through what he did. And then you kind of feel like you might be impacting. Why the others didn't contact us? Big companies tend to have a sort of barrier of communication. I found a company called Cereal Partners in Melksham who make breakfast cereals. They're 50% owned by Nestle. It's impossible to phone the company up. There's no phone numbers. You can't ring them up. You can't email them directly. You end up on a section of the Nestle website where you can complain if your shreddies weren't square. It's hardly an effective way of saying, please, could you pass this on to your environmental sustainability manager for the Cereal Partners thing. And then after you've tried, you've banged your head against that for an hour or so, you sort of give up and say, well, I've sent off the requirement. Others, it just falls into a black hole. I think it might indicate that people who are receiving these sort of random emails into organizations might be able to deal with a sales inquiry or a customer complaint, but it kind of isn't in the existing way of doing things. Oh, here's another person interested in our sustainability picture. And so it gets passed around, and there's nobody who's nominated in the governments of that business to pick it up. One firm making a well-known bicycle with really small wheels that you can fold up and carry on the train. Never responded, rang them up, emailed them, just wouldn't get back to us. So it was weird. I just think generally, small, medium-sized businesses at the moment, they're not regulated. They don't have to do it unless they have a specific brand and ethos reason for doing so, as Cheris has just explained for Good Energy. Then they're not doing much. They're focused on staying in business, keeping costs down, paying the wages, and delivering the goods to customers. So very hard. Everyone I speak to says it's really hard engaging with business. My experience in the last year is I agree, but it isn't going to stop us from trying. Anyone else got any other questions for myself or Cherish? There's a new message come on the bottom, or if there's Kim's got your hand up. I'm asking you to unmute, Kim. Do you want to speak now?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. Okay, hi, thank you. No, I just wanted to say, in terms of the people that you were contacting, we're a small company, so I work for Novacast, and I'm the management accountant, but have taken on the role of sustainability coordinator as well, because there isn't anybody else in the company because we're so small. And I'm just wondered if you're contacting our MD, sometimes they have so many emails that they just forget, because I would have been more involved in this had I known that you were doing this, but I didn't know that you were doing any of this. And will you be reassessing companies? Because we've actually received a silver award for sustainability from EcoVadis in February 23. So we've significantly improved our CO2 emissions. We take place in the Carbon Disclosure Project. And I just think it would be good to show improvements if you're going to reassess So yeah, so basically sometimes it's about contacting getting hold of the right person, isn't it? Even in smaller companies as well as the larger companies.
Yeah, absolutely right. I've become more and more concerned that whilst we all spend loads of our life reading emails and sending emails, I wonder if it's actually that effective a way of actually communicating. It's okay if you know the person you're sending to knows who you are and they're going to pick it up and deal with it. A kind of random email sent into a firm with big bold at the top, please pass this for the attention of the manager responsible for sustainability, doesn't quite seem to work. So yeah, I accept what you say. Thanks that you're here today. That's brilliant. I'd be happy to take another look at what you're doing now with some new evidence and data, and then assess that with the same set of criteria we use to see whether that does show a big increase. I'm sure it would. I'm familiar with EcoVadis. I remember when I was in the supply of components in the motor industry, that EcoVadis was being used by many firms to assess their suppliers. So that sounds like a laudable organisation to team up with. And if you've got an award from them, I'm immediately beginning to think that must be really good. So why don't we touch base offline and then
that's brilliant. Thank you.
Make contact. I'd be happy to spend a bit of time looking at what you've done now and see how that might have impacted on.
That's brilliant. Thanks ever so much. I'll give you an email.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Any questions, or have I missed anything from the chat? Struggling with my multitasking capability here of speaking, listening and reading at the same time. I can't see anyone else with their hands up. One question I did have actually, Cherish, when I was listening to your talk, it's clear that if you worked at your organisation, there'd be a really kind of strong ethos about the way the actions you take during your working life impact on your business, even down to how much milk you have in your tea, maybe. Do you think that what you do at work then helps your businesses change the way they live their lives outside of work? Do you think there's a strong link there?
I think so. Dependable on the people that we employ. I mean, it really comes down to recruitment as well. We're looking for people that share the same values as us. So us particularly, they do have the same practices at home as in the office. But I perhaps couldn't speak for another company that might not put as much effort into recruiting those types of values as we do.
Excellent, thanks very much. Well, I think I've covered all the questions in the chat. Can someone flag me up if I've missed a line in the obvious chat question? Is anyone else? There we are. Julie, hello.
Yeah, hello, Keith. That's really, really great presentation. Thank you so much, Keith and Cherish. Cherish, I just wanted to understand, have you been able to get any feedback from customers on how they feel about, how important it is to buy from a sustainable, in practice, energy provider? Has that helped you as a business?
Yeah, so I think, forgive me if this doesn't answer your question, so feel free to call me out on that. But due to the nature of our energy, we're not the cheapest energy provider. Our energy is supplied by an independent network of 1,700 generators across the UK, and then we match the amount of energy that we buy from them and then sell that same amount of energy to our customers. But the reason why our customers are still with us is because they're wanting to make a green choice. And we often get that feedback from our customers that they are with us, and some customers have been with us for a long time, but they're with us because they are wanting to make the green-minded choice. And unfortunately, and this is a whole conversation on climate justice separately aside, unfortunately for people that want to make a green choice but don't have the money, that's another matter. But our customers are green-minded, and that's why they come to us. We're not really even looking for the people, we're not wanting to supply the people that aren't, because we know we won't be competitive.
Fair enough.
Does that answer your question?
It does, yeah. I mean, I just wondered if you share the data that you've just shared with us, for example, your graph. I mean, maybe not that graph, but, you know, do you share that data with some of your larger customers? I mean, do they ask you for that? That's interesting, actually.
The carbon data.
Yeah.
We do have some queries that come in from our larger customers, more so from a procurement point of view, making sure that we are who we say we are, that we've got the certifications that we say we are. And we do have the odd query that comes in from customers, one more recently around our paper consumption from the letters that we still send out to some people that haven't gone on to digital statements. But yeah, not that often, actually.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just interested from the point of view of whether this is going to become, you know, as you say, we're all starting out somewhere, but whether customers are going to become more demanding in that way in the future and start to ask those questions. So you having started this great work is going to, you know, put you in a good position for the future.
Yeah, I hope so.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Julie. I see that Martin Smith has got his yellow hand up. Hello, Martin. How are you?
Hi, Keith. Not so bad, thanks. I thought that's a really great session. It's great work you've done there. It's such an important sector to try and influence. But I noticed that there's a couple of other Wiltshire councillors on the call as well, and I was just keen to sort of understand what one of your next steps was around potentially trying to get industrial premises built to better standards and all this sort of thing. And I was just wondering whether Ariane or others on the call can see any scope for that in the near future, because I know that Wiltshire Council is working on its revised local plan for the next period going forwards, and that deals with planning issues and potentially the sort of regulations around building, etc. And I was just wondering whether there's any way that Wiltshire Council can do something extra in this area, or whether we're completely reliant on, central government setting the rules and us having to follow. I don't know whether there's anybody there that can answer that.
That's a really good question, because that was what I had when I put that down. It seemed to me that if there's lots and lots of small houses that we're going to try and retrofit and change, that's a big job. And yet at the same time, you see massive, great big industrial sheds being put down. And when I drive by on the way to Chippenham, it's huge. And you think, why isn't the roof covered with solar panels? What sort of insulation standard? What lighting have been told? I don't understand enough about that area, but it feels like, much in the way as I've said, that a change in a big business can be a really big change, rather than all the employees going home and switching their lights off. If the business have control of their lighting, one decision to think. Maybe you could do the same with planning rules around big commercial installations and buildings, but I don't know where the council has that. Ariane, you've got your hand up to help me, because I don't have an answer.
Yeah, I mean, can you hear me all right? Because this headset wasn't working very well earlier. Okay, good. So if you're talking about new builds, then obviously the local plan is going to be, with a whole new suite of planning policies, is going to be out for consultation very soon. So we will be doing everything we can as part of the new planning policies to push the standards as high as we can on low carbon new builds. In terms of retrofit, I don't believe we have any powers whatsoever. We don't have any powers for domestic properties. We don't have any powers for commercial properties. Unfortunately, that's the reality of things. We do get a lot of inquiries from businesses, and we do have the Target 2030 programme, which is now almost fully allocated. That's been incredibly successful. So that's free energy audits for SMEs and grants towards energy efficiency and renewable energy improvements. We are looking at extending that programme because it's been so successful, using UK Shared Prosperity Funds. So allocating a proportion of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund to extend that programme, because, as I say, the money's kind of pretty much all being used up. So that would be really good if we can do that, because that will help with the whole retrofit agenda. But honestly, you know, it's only a very small proportion of businesses who actually go down that route and get a free energy audit and follow through on the recommendations. So it is quite difficult.
Seems to be the phrase of it. It is quite difficult. I think probably the phrase that I would use as the motto of the WCA Business Engagement Work Group. And probably from what I'm seeing from other organisations, maybe that's the motto others have got. Which I think leads me, as it's just about time that I said we'd finish, really happy that the 13:15 in the corner of my screen is the same number I put on the first slide about when we'd end. So that feels good. My struggle, I think, my sort of request for a bit of help is where I'm going to focus the limited resources that the WCA have got to try and get the most impact of engaging with business. It feels pointless trying to get onto Nestle and saying, you know, make less chocolate, use less milk, or rig up something like Goodyear tyres and say, when you're making tyres at the old Avon plant, can you do it this way? And yet the gaps that's shown up is that yawning gap of inactivity in small and micro-sized businesses. And where the best place to do that is that to be interacting with, you know, as I am here with the local Malmesbury town team, with the shops in the high street, like have some help in learning how to be more green. There's some great work being done down in Salisbury where they're trying to introduce a new green business award scheme for retailers and shops. And that's being trialled at the moment. Maybe that's something the council could get involved in duplicating and putting down through local town councils across the county. I suspect that the most effective engagement might be in the small to medium sized end of businesses across Wilts, and that you'd probably be wasting your time trying to get a big organisation to change its policy. So if anyone's got any ideas or thoughts to share now, or contact me afterwards with where they could take that, then I'd love to engage with people on that. And finally, anyone on the call would like to get a bit involved with Wiltshire Climate Alliance and work on the business engagement project, even though it's really quite difficult, please contact me afterwards. I'll send out copies of the slides as PDF, and as long as Cherish is happy with those slides, we'll make those available as well. And we'll send a link where you can download those. You can, if you wish, copy the chat if there's anything in there that's useful. And my email address is available if someone wants to pick up with me afterwards. That's all from me. Thank you very much for attending. Cherish, thanks for taking the time and effort to explain what it's like out there in the real business world. That was really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith.
Well, unless anyone's got any burning desire to speak, I suggest it's time I go and have my sandwich for lunch. Thank you very much for attending, and we'll be in contact soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.